Welcome to the deep dive. So glad you're joining us today because we are looking at something honestly pretty wild in the business world right now.
Yeah, it's a massive, massive shift.
Right. We are talking about why some of the most genuinely sustainable, forward-thinking companies on Earth are certainly, terrified to talk about the environment.
Which sounds completely backwards, I know.
Exactly. To figure out why that is happening, we are opening up a really fascinating slide deck. It's from Professor Mikhail Kostela's university course on business sustainability.
And the material is it's incredibly detailed.
It really is. Our mission today is to kind of shortcut the information overload for you.
Yeah.
We want to equip you to spot the difference between, genuine sustainability and just really expensive marketing tricks.
Because the stakes are incredibly high right now.
Oh, yeah. We are not just talking about PR disasters today. We're talking about multi-million-dollar regulatory fines, literal corporate espionage where rivals are telling on each other, and the rise of this weird trend where green companies are basically hiding their own achievements.
It really represents a fundamental paradigm shift in how companies communicate.
Right.
The whole era of treating sustainability claims as this low-risk, high-reward PR exercise, that is effectively over.
Done.
Yeah. Costela's material maps out exactly how the legal and market definitions of greenwashing have basically grown up. They've turned these vague environmental assertions into massive financial liabilities.
So to understand how those liabilities actually get triggered, we first have to understand the architecture of a green claim. How does it work? And more importantly, how does it break?
Exactly.
When I was reviewing Costela's framework, I immediately thought about movie trailer.
Okay, I like that.
Right. Because we have all seen a trailer that features this stunning, highly choreographed 2-minute car chase.
Oh, sure.
And you buy a ticket based on that trailer, only to realize that car chase was the singular action sequence in a 2-hour film that is otherwise just filled with terrible dialogue.
Yeah, the classic bait and switch.
Exactly.
Mm-mm.
The trailer was technically factual, that scene did exist in the movie. But it was entirely deceptive regarding the overall nature of the product.
That aligns perfectly with how the source breaks down environmental marketing. Because a green claim is not just one thing. It relies on 3 distinct structural pillars.
Okay, break those down for me.
So first is the claim itself. That's the public-facing assertion, the bold text on the packaging saying carbon negative or ocean friendly.
Right, the marketing copy.
Exactly. Second is the evidence. That's the empirical life cycle data that actually backs up that specific assertion.
Got it.
And third, and this is critical, is the scope. The scope defines the exact boundaries of the claim. Does this apply to the entire multinational corporation or just one product line or, literally just the cardboard shipping box?
Oh, wow. So greenwashing happens when one of those pillars falls apart.
Usually it happens when a company manipulates the scope, but they rely on you, the audience, to just assume it applies to everything.
Costela's material uses the 100% recycled beverage bottle to illustrate this, right?
That's a perfect example.
Because, as a consumer, you pick up a bottle, you read 100% recycled in this nice green typography, and you assume, hey, I'm making a great environmental choice.
Right, you feel good about it.
But the claim is only technically accurate regarding the plastic body of the bottle itself. The wraparound label and the plastic cap are actually manufactured from virgin, highly polluting plastics.
Which completely changes the impact.
But I look at that and think, well, the body of the bottle is still recycled, right? Which is a net positive for the environment. So why is the source so insistent on penalizing that as greenwashing?
Because treating that true but incomplete assertion as just harmless marketing completely ignores the downstream macroeconomic effects.
What do you mean by that?
Well, Costela's course frames this as a distinct market failure. Think about an honest enterprise that actually invests significant capital to overhaul its entire supply chain.
Right, they do the hard work.
Exactly. They source recycled materials for the cap, the label, the bottle, everything. Because of that, they inherently have to increase their unit price to absorb those transition costs.
So they're doing the actual systemic work, but it basically compresses their profit margins.
Meanwhile, a competitor alters absolutely nothing but the plastic body of their bottle. They keep their cheap virgin plastic supply chain for the rest of the packaging, and they print the exact same 100% recycled claim on the front.
Oh, that is so frustrating.
It is. This competitor captures the exact same consumer premium without spending the money. So the bad actor undercuts the honest firm, and it actively destroys the market signal.
Because consumers who are trying to vote with their wallets are just getting tricked.
Exactly. And honest corporations are basically financially penalized for doing the right thing. It creates this race to the bottom.
And Koslow categorizes corporate sustainability efforts into value, cost, and theater.
Right.
Now,
And this manipulation of scope we just talked about, that is pure theater.
that concept of theater perfectly sets up the specific language that regulators are actively targeting right now.
They are definitely paying attention.
Yeah, and reviewing the source material. The most heavily scrutinized phrase in corporate marketing right now is, quote, carbon neutral.
Which is causing a lot of panic.
But I actually had to push back on the source here a little bit.
Yeah.
Because decarbonization and neutrality aren't those the macro goals of the entire global energy transition.
Yeah, absolutely are.
So it seems entirely counterintuitive to me that claiming carbon neutrality is suddenly considered this massive regulatory liability. Why is that a red flag?
Well, the liability doesn't stem from the goal of neutrality itself. It comes from the mechanism companies are using to claim they've achieved it.
Okay, see how they get there.
Right. Because the overwhelming majority of these carbon neutral claims rely on carbon offsets.
No, the credits.
Exactly. A corporation basically calculates its continued emissions, and then they just purchase credits from a third party, usually tied to like forestry or conservation projects, to theoretically cancel out their pollution.
So they are still polluting.
Yes. The structural failure occurs in that evidence pillar we talked about, because extensive auditing has revealed that a vast percentage of these carbon credits are just of incredibly poor quality.
Wait, really? Like they don't actually work?
Often, no. They frequently fund projects that overstate their impact, or they fail to provide permanent carbon storage. Sometimes they just simply don't represent any additional emissions reductions at all.
So the company's basically purchasing a cheap accounting trick to maintain their current operational footprint
Yes.
instead of, actually engineering the emissions out of their supply chain.
Precisely. And that failure in the evidence pillar, relying on offsets that look robust on a ledger but fail in the actual atmosphere, is what finally pushed advocacy groups to change their tactics.
Right, they got tired of playing nice.
They did. They stopped writing open letters and they just started filing lawsuits.
Which brings us to the landmark KLM Airlines case that the source details.
Yes, let's talk about KLM. Because they launched this highly sophisticated, really aesthetically driven campaign called Fly Responsibly.
It was everywhere.
It featured all this extensive environmental imagery, and they offered customers a product called CO2Z0,
Right.
which basically allowed passengers to pay a premium to theoretically offset the emissions of their individual flight.
And what makes this case study so fascinating is the legal mechanism that was actually used to dismantle it.
Yeah, because it wasn't a government aviation authority that brought them down, was it?
No, not at all. And it wasn't even pursued under environmental law. Two non-governmental organizations, Fossil Freeze and Client Earth, utilized standard consumer protection law to drag a major airline into a Dutch court.
That is brilliant. They essentially argued this was just fraudulent advertising. Exactly. And in March 2024, the District Court of Amsterdam ruled decisively in favor of the NGOs. They found that 15 of KLM's 19 claims were basically unlawful.
15 out of 19.
Yeah. And the ruling maps identically to our three-pillar framework. First, the evidence collapsed. The court determined that those CO2 offsets did not validly mitigate the immediate, intensive climate impact of burning jet fuel.
And they failed the scope test entirely.
Oh, spectacularly.
Because the airline was promoting this whole fly responsibly narrative, but at the same time, their internal corporate strategy involved aggressively expanding their overall volume of flights.
Right, they were growing their footprint while claiming to shrink it.
So the macro growth in their emissions completely eclipsed any micro efficiencies they were achieving. It rendered all those broad marketing claims totally deceptive.
And they were also heavily penalized for what the court termed aspirational greenwashing.
Aspirational greenwashing, what does that mean?
It's when you paint a highly optimistic picture of future technological targets. For KLM, it was things like sustainable aviation fuels that are, frankly, currently not scalable.
Ah, I see.
They use the promise of future innovations to provide this halo effect for their highly polluting present-day operations.
That makes total sense.
The significance of this ruling really cannot be overstated, because it transitioned greenwashing from just a reputational risk managed by PR teams into a material legal liability that is managed by the General Counsel.
And that transition from a PR headache to a material liability is accelerating globally. Although, looking at the source, the regulatory architecture varies wildly depending on the jurisdiction.
It's a patchwork, definitely.
The enforcement mechanisms are changing fast, and the UK actually provides the most severe example of this shift, because historically, pursuing a greenwashing claim required a really protracted court battle.
But that is no longer the case. The UK's Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA, has fundamentally altered the risk calculus for corporations.
How so?
Well, under their newly implemented DMCC Act, the CMA is actually empowered to bypass the traditional court system entirely.
Wait, really? No trial?
No trial. They can directly levy administrative fines of up to 10% of a company's global turnover for misleading environmental claims.
10% of global revenue. That is an existential threat to most enterprise business models.
It is terrifying for corporate boards.
And Constell's material notes that this is a strict liability environment, meaning the intent of the marketing team is completely irrelevant.
Right. An inadvertent oversight regarding the lifecycle data of a product still constitutes a breach.
That is intense. And we are also seeing the UK's Advertising Standards Authority aggressively policing this space, right? They recently banned campaigns from Nike and Superdry for lacking robust substantiation.
They did, but interestingly, the ASA actually cleared a really contentious advertisement from Shell during this exact same period.
Shell, an oil company. How did they get cleared?
The differentiating factor was contextual honesty. Shell promoted a specific renewable energy initiative, but they prominently disclosed alongside it that the vast majority of their capital expenditures were still allocated to fossil fuel extraction.
Oh, so they told the truth about the big picture.
Exactly. By integrating that contrasting data, they accurately defined the scope of their claim. It prevented the consumer from just assuming Shell had transitioned entirely to green energy.
So context really is everything.
It is. Now, the European Union takes a markedly different philosophical approach to this problem.
Right, because instead of relying purely on punitive post-marketing enforcement like the UK, the EU is implementing binding structural bans.
Yes, through the Empowering Consumers Directive.
Right. Any generic environmental adjective terms like eco-friendly, green, or climate neutral is explicitly banned outright unless it is accompanied by massive, verified substantiation.
And they also specifically prohibited any claim of carbon neutrality that relies solely on offsetting.
The EU's strategy seems to be all about centralization and standardization.
It is. However, the source material notes a really critical piece of legislative nuance here. The EU originally proposed an even stricter framework called the Green Claims Directive.
Oh, I read about that. What happened to it?
Well, it would have required independent, third-party scientific verification of every single environmental claim before a product could even go to market.
Every single claim.
Every single one.
But they ultimately withdrew that pre-verification requirement, right?
Yeah.
Because of the sheer administrative burden it would place on the market.
Exactly. Requiring a mid-sized enterprise to scientifically validate every single localized marketing translation would have just frozen commerce in red tape.
So they compromised. They maintained the hard bans on the vague adjectives and the offset-driven neutrality, but they softened the pre-market approval process.
Right. And then you contrast that centralized European approach with the United States, which the source basically describes as a highly fragmented, contested patchwork.
A total Wild West.
Pretty much. At the federal level, the Federal Trade Commission's green guides offer basic parameters. But they are purely advisory, and they've been stalled in a revision process for over a decade.
And nature abhors a vacuum.
Right.
So in the absence of strong federal U.S. regulation, enforcement has just been entirely privatized and localized.
Which is incredibly messy.
We are seeing a massive surge in consumer class action lawsuits alongside really aggressive state-level legislation. California's AB 1305 is a prime example of this.
Yes, California is leading the charge there.
It mandates severe daily financial penalties for corporations that cannot publicly surface the exact verification methodology behind their carbon-neutral claims.
And this fragmented environment has also created this wild phenomenon where environmental law is essentially being weaponized for corporate espionage.
Yes, the enforcers you didn't expect.
Right. It is a highly effective asymmetric tactic. Think about it. If a company wants to hamstring a competitor, they don't even need to outperform them in the market anymore.
They just audit them.
Exactly. They audit the competitor's packaging, they find some poorly scoped biodegradable claim, and they just file a formal complaint with regulators or initiate a lawsuit.
The source actually cites Ecover doing exactly this to a rival cleaning brand.
Yes, the regulatory matrix is literally being used actively as a competitive bludgeon.
And it is not just competitors. Institutional investors are utilizing these same frameworks.
Oh, the investor lawsuits are huge.
Yeah, activist groups have successfully sued major asset managers like BlackRock for marketing ESG and sustainable funds that were quietly holding billions of dollars in fossil fuel expansion assets.
Which brings us to the most logical question.
Right. Looking at this landscape objectively, with the UK levying 10% revenue fines, the EU outright banning common marketing terminology, and U.S. competitors weaponizing class actions, why say anything?
Exactly.
The rational strategy for any corporate board right now is simply to cease all environmental communication. Even if a firm is achieving incredible sustainability milestones, the expected value of publishing that data is currently negative.
And that exact risk assessment has birthed the most significant unintended consequence of this entire regulatory crackdown. It's a trend called green hushing.
Green hushing.
Yes. If greenwashing is the act of exaggerating environmental performance, green hushing is the deliberate, strategic suppression of genuine, scientifically sound sustainability metrics.
They just stay silent.
Yes, specifically to avoid legal and public scrutiny.
The source material relies on some really comprehensive survey data from the climate consultancy South Pole to demonstrate just how pervasive this has become.
The numbers are actually startling.
A huge percentage of corporations that have established highly credible science-based climate targets are actively choosing to keep those targets entirely hidden from the public and from their consumers.
And the material identifies two distinct compounding pressures that are driving this phenomenon.
Okay, what are they?
The first is obviously the intense regulatory scrutiny we just dissected, but the second is a documented anti-ESG backlash. It's emanating from specific political and market factions that actively penalize corporations for prioritizing environmental and social governance over, immediate shareholder returns.
Now, to maintain strict impartiality here for you listening, we are not evaluating the validity of the ESG framework, nor are we endorsing the political backlash against it.
Exactly. We're just looking at the data.
Right. We're strictly analyzing the documented market reality presented in Costola's course. Corporate executives are basically trapped in a pincer movement.
They really are.
They face severe regulatory penalties if they overstate their efforts, and they face coordinated market backlash if they emphasize them at all.
But regardless of the political origins of that pressure, the resulting green hushing is highly detrimental to the macroeconomic transition.
Why is it so dangerous?
Because it functions similarly to a dark pool in financial markets. It completely obscures the true state of innovation and progress.
Oh, I see.
If a company engineers a breakthrough in sustainable manufacturing but they refuse to publicize it, they fail to establish a new industry benchmark.
Which means competitors aren't pressured to adapt.
Exactly. Consumers cannot reward the innovation with market share, and public accountability just vanishes entirely. I mean, a target that is never stated publicly can be quietly abandoned 5 years later without consequence.
Let's operationalize this tension using a thought experiment inspired by the source material. Imagine a mid-sized consumer goods company named Verda.
Okay, Verda.
Operationally, Verda is doing exceptional work. They have reduced their direct manufacturing emissions by 20%. They transitioned their packaging to 70% post-consumer recycled material.
That's great progress.
Right. And they have committed to a verified net zero target for 2035. Now, the chief marketing officer wants to aggressively publicize this to capture market share from legacy competitors.
Naturally.
But as their general counsel, assessing the global regulatory landscape we just talked about, how do you advise them?
Well, the legal counsel has to heavily restrict the marketing team. Because while Verda's internal metrics are excellent, their external supply chain, which accounts for the vast majority of their overall carbon footprint, remains highly reliant on fossil fuels.
The hidden scope.
Exactly. Furthermore, to achieve their current carbon neutral status on their flagship product, they are heavily dependent on those low-quality offsets we discussed.
So they have some skeletons in the closet.
Big ones. If they run a broad aspirational campaign, the UK CMA will immediately flag the scope violation regarding their supply chain, and California will demand substantiation for the offsets that Verda just cannot provide.
So the general counsel advises complete silence. They mandate green hushing.
But here is the trap. Silence is no longer a safe harbor either.
Why not?
Because if Verda goes completely dark on their environmental data, they immediately alienate their large institutional investors.
Oh, right. Because the investors need the data.
Yes. Those asset managers are operating under their own strict disclosure requirements. They legally require that transition data from Verda just to balance their portfolios.
So silence gets them sued by investors.
Or just dropped. Furthermore, silence in a market that increasingly values transparency often leads consumers and rating agencies to just assume the company's internal metrics are actively degrading.
The binary options of loud, unverified marketing or complete silence have both been closed off by regulators and the market. So what do?
Costello's material proposes a specific operational framework for navigating this, which he terms the narrow path.
The narrow path.
Yes, it requires a complete abandonment of the traditional emotion-driven marketing playbook in favor of rigorous, data-driven discipline.
So the narrow path is entirely about precision and proportionality.
Exactly. Communication must transition from adjectives to audited metrics. A company can no longer claim a product as, nature-friendly. They must explicitly state, this product utilizes 70% recycled plastic.
Because 70% can be verified through supply chain invoices and life cycle assessments, whereas nature-friendly is just an abstract concept that cannot be defended in an administrative tribunal.
Exactly. Numbers beat adjectives every time.
Right.
Secondly, they must proactively abandon any terminology that relies on offsetting. The era of claiming carbon neutrality while actively emitting carbon is closed.
Done.
But the most difficult adjustment for corporate communications teams is the requirement to openly embrace and advertise their own trade-offs.
Wait, you are saying Verda has to voluntarily highlight their dirty supply chain in their own marketing materials?
Yes.
That sounds crazy.
It sounds counterintuitive, but contextualizing progress alongside persistent challenges is the ultimate defense against a greenwashing claim.
So how would that actually look?
If Verda states, look, we have achieved 70% recycled packaging, but our upstream logistics remain carbon intensive, and here is the capital we allocated this quarter to address that specific gap.
Oh, wow. They just lay it all out there.
Yes. They have perfectly defined the scope of their claim. And that level of radical candor actively builds durable trust with both consumers and regulators.
Because it demonstrates that the company understands its full life cycle impact and is actively managing it, rather than just highlighting a flattering slice of data.
Exactly.
It maps perfectly back to the core thesis of the course. The glossy, unverified claims and the heady scopes are the theater of sustainability.
Right.
And the intense legal and scientific work required to audit and substantiate every metric is the cost.
Yes.
But value, the ultimate goal, is achieved through precise evidence claims that own their flaws and build long-term, unassailable market trust.
When a company adopts that discipline, environmental communication transitions from a massive legal liability back into a genuine, defensible corporate asset.
So for you listening, the next time you are analyzing a corporate sustainability report or just evaluating a product on a shelf, you now have the framework to look past the theater.
You know exactly what to look for.
Right. You are no longer just absorbing the claim. You are immediately seeking the evidence and you're interrogating the scope. You understand that broad adjectives or offset-reliant neutrality are structural red flags indicating a gap between marketing and reality.
Absolutely. But Costello's material leaves us with a final, much deeper structural question.
Yeah, this part really stuck with me.
It's profound. Even if a corporation adheres perfectly to the narrow path, providing exquisite evidence and perfectly defining their scope, can a fundamentally high-impact, heavily polluting product ever honestly carry a green claim?
It is the ultimate boundary of the scope pillar.
Think about a fast fashion garment designed with synthetic fibers intended to be discarded after 3 wears.
Or a 3-ton luxury SUV.
Or a transatlantic flight.
Duh.
If an automaker engineers an SUV to be 10% more fuel efficient than the previous year's model, and they advertise that highly specific, perfectly evidenced metric, is that transparency actually useful?
Or is being slightly greener on a fundamentally unsustainable product just a much more sophisticated movie trailer for the exact same terrible film?
Right. This tension is actually driving a movement among certain legal advocates to push for tobacco-style advertising bans on fossil fuel-reliant products.
Like completely banning the ads.
Yes. The argument is that the core utility of the product is so inherently damaging that any environmental marketing, no matter how technically accurate, is structurally deceptive to the public.
It forces us to determine where the line is actually drawn between mitigating harm and merely marketing it. It is definitely something to critically evaluate the next time you see a highly specific, legally compliant advertisement asking you to fly responsibly. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.